Chapter 7. When I sleep, I dream, and in my dreams, I can do anything. I get picked first on the playground for games. I can run so fast. I take gymnastics, and I never fall off the balance beam. I know how to square dance, and I'm good at it. I call my friends on the phone, and we talk for hours. I whisper secrets. I sing. When I wake up in the morning, it's always sort of a letdown as reality hits me. I have to be fed and dressed so I can spend another long day in the happy face room at Spalding Street School. Along with the assortment of teachers we had in room H5, there have been more classroom aides than I can count. These aides, usually one guy to help with the boys and one lady to help with the girls, do stuff like take us to the bathroom or change diapers on kids like Ashley and Carl, feed us at lunch, wheel us where we need to go, wipe mouths, and give hugs. I don't think they get paid very much because they never stay very long, but they should get $1 million. What they do is really hard, and I don't think most folks get that. It's even hard to keep good teachers for us. I guess I don't blame them for leaving, because, like I said, we're a tough bunch to handle sometimes. But once in a while, we get a good one. After Squeaky Mrs. Hyatt for kindergarten and Game Show Mr. Gross for first grade, Mrs. Tracy breezed into our room for second grade. She figured out that I like books, so she got some earphones and hooked me up with audio books on CD. She started with baby stuff like Dr. Seuss, which my father and I had read when I was 2. So after I tossed those on the floor a couple times, instead of punishing me, she figured out I needed something better. I listened to all of the Babysitter's Club books and those Goofy Goosebumps books. She asked me questions after each book, and I got every single question right. Things like, which of these helped solve the mystery? Then she showed me a pebble, a starfish, and an ink pen. The pebble, of course. She'd cheer after we'd gone through the questions, and then hook me up to another book. That year, I listened to all the books by Beverly Cleary and all the books about those boxcar kids. It was awesome. The next year, it all unraveled. I know teachers are supposed to write notes to the next teacher in line so they know what to expect, but either Mrs. Tracy didn't do it, or Mrs. Billups, our third grade teacher, didn't read them. Mrs. Billups started every morning by playing her favorite CD. I hated it. Old MacDonald Had a Farm, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, The Itsy Bitsy Spider, all sung by children who could not sing. The type of music grown-ups think is all kinds of cute, but it's awful. Mrs. Billups put it on at full volume every single morning, over and over and over. No wonder we were always in a bad mood. Once she had the Tin Pan Band on. Mrs. Billups went over the alphabet every single day with third graders. Now, children, this is an A. How many of you can say A? Good. She'd smile and say good, even if nobody in the class responded. I wondered if she would teach able-bodied third graders the same way. Probably not. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Now let's move on to B. This is the letter B. Let's all say B. Good. Again to silence. She didn't seem to care. I glanced with longing at the books on tape and the earphones, which had been shoved into a corner. One day, I guess, I'd had enough. Mrs. Billups had expanded from saying the letters to making the sound of each one. Buh, she said loudly, spitting a little as she did. Buh is the sound of the letter B. Let's all say buh together, children. Then Maria, who was always in a good mood, started throwing crayons. Willie began to babble, and I bellowed. I may not be able to make clear sounds, but I can make a lot of noise. I screamed because I hated stuff that was just plain stupid. I screeched because I couldn't talk and tell her to shut up. And that made me cry because I'd never be able to tell anybody what I was really thinking. So I screamed and yelled and shrieked. I cried like a 2-year-old. I would not stop. Then my tornado explosion took over. I flailed and jerked and basically spazzed out. I kicked so hard that my shoes popped off one of the foot straps on my chair. That made me tilt to one side and I screamed even louder. Mrs. Billups didn't know what to do. She tried to calm me down, but I didn't want to be calmed. Even the aides couldn't stop me. Jill and Maria started to cry. Even Ashley, dressed in all yellow that day, looked upset. Freddie spun his chair around in circles, glancing sideways at me fearfully. Carl hollered for lunch. Then he pooped in his pants again. The whole class was out of control, and I kept screeching. The teacher called Mrs. Anthony, the principal, whose eyes got wide as she opened our door. She took one look at the situation and said tersely, "Call her mother." She could not have left more quickly. A moment later, the teacher had my mother on the phone. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Melody's teacher, Anastasia Billups. Can you come to the school right away?" I knew my mother had to be worried. Was I sick? Bleeding? Dead? "No, she's not ill. She's fine, we think," Mrs. Billups was saying in her most professional-sounding teacher voice. "We just can't get her to stop screaming. She's got the whole class in an uproar." I could picture my mother on the other end of the line, trying to figure out what was going on. Luckily, it was her day off. I knew she'd be there in a few minutes, so I gradually calmed down and finally shut up. The other kids quieted down as well, like somebody had clicked off the switch. Old MacDonald continued to play. My mother arrived faster than I thought possible. When I saw her jeans and dirty sweatshirt, I realized she'd dropped everything and jumped in the car. She ran over to me and asked what was wrong. I took a few deep, shuddering breaths, then I pointed to the alphabet on my talking board and screeched some sounds in frustration. "This is about the alphabet?" my mother asked. "Yes," I pointed, then pounded on the answer. She turned to Mrs. Billups. "What were you working on before all the screaming started?" Mrs. Billups replied in that superior tone that teachers dressed in nice red business suits use when they're talking to mothers with dirty shirts on. "We're reviewing the alphabet, of course. The sound of the letter B, if I recall. I always start with the basics. These children need constant review because they don't retain information like the rest of us." My mother was getting the picture. "So you were going over the ABCs. Correct. It's February." "I beg your pardon?" "School started in August. You haven't gotten past the letter B in 6 months?" Mom was bawling and unballing her fists. I've never seen my mother hit anything, but when I see her doing that, I always wonder if she might. "Who are you to tell me how to run my class?" the teacher asked angrily. "And who are you to bore these children with mindless activities?" my mother snapped back. "How dare you?" the teacher gasped. "I dare anything for my daughter," Mom replied, her voice dangerous, "and for the rest of these children." "You don't understand," the teacher began. Mom interrupted her. "No, Mrs. Billups, it is you who does not understand." Mom looked like she was trying to calm herself down, because then she said, "Look, have you ever said to yourself, if they show that stupid commercial on TV one more time, I think I'll just scream?" Mrs. Billups nodded slowly. "Or, if I have to sit 5 more minutes in this traffic jam, I'll simply explode?" "Yes, I suppose," she admitted. "Well, I think that's what happened to Melody. She said to herself, if I have to go over those letters one more time, I'll just scream. So she did. I really don't blame her, do you?" Mrs. Billups looked from my mother to me. "I guess not, now that you explain it that way," Mrs. Billups finally said, her voice now as calm as my mother's. "Melody knows her alphabet, all the sounds of the letters, and hundreds of words on sight. She can add and subtract numbers in her head. We discussed all this at our last parent conference, didn't we?" I could tell my mother was trying to control her temper. "I thought you were exaggerating," the teacher said. Parents are not always realistic when it comes to these children. If you call them these children one more time, I might scream, my mother warned. But Melody does have mental and physical limitations, Mrs. Billups argued, trying to put Mom in her place, I guess. You have to learn to accept that. And the fire was back. Melody can't walk. Melody can't talk, but she is extremely intelligent, and you better learn to accept that, Mom spat out. The teacher backed up an inch or two. Didn't you read her records from last year? Mom demanded. Melody loves listening to books on tape. I try to approach each child with an open mind and not be influenced by other teachers. All the records are in a box someplace. Maybe you should find that box, my mom said, her lips tight. Well, I never, Mrs. Billups countered. Maybe that's your problem, Mom replied with a grin. Then she tilted her head and turned toward the CD player. Oh, one more thing. May I see that wonderful CD you're playing? Of course, Mrs. Billups said, smiling a little. The children love this. Do they? Mom asked. The teacher lifted the disc from the player. Twinkle, twinkle, silence. Willie sighed out loud. Mom took the CD, dug down in her purse for a moment, gave Mrs. Billups a $5 bill, and deftly snapped the disc in half. That music was cruel and unusual punishment. Freddie and Maria cheered. Gloria whispered, "Thank you." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for Mrs. Billups. She looked so confused. She just didn't get it. Mom walked over to the sink in our room, turned on the warm water, and soaked a stack of paper towels under the faucet. She came back to me and gently wiped my face with the warm, soggy wad. Nothing had ever felt so soothing. She then brushed my hair, adjusted the straps and buckles on my chair, gave me a quick hug, and went home. Mrs. Billups quit her job after spring break, so we ended up with a series of subs till the end of the year. I think she had figured it would be easy to work with people who were dumber than she was. She was wrong.